Hi everyone, welcome back to our literature class today. My name is Percy and we are going to focus on the Enlightenment period in England. I have a previous lesson on the Renaissance and the Romantic period. You can browse it. This period, the Enlightenment period, is in between those two periods. So there's the Renaissance period and the Romantic period. In between is the Enlightenment period, which we're going to focus on right now. I titled this lecture The Rise of Satire in the Age of Reason, English Enlightenment period. And again, just a quick background. We talked about the Old English period and the Middle English period, and we are also done with the Renaissance period recently. So right now we are going to focus on this period, which is also known as the neoclassical period in some other literatures or scholarly references. And it is also called the Enlightenment period. Okay, the Enlightenment, neoclassical, Age of Reason. There are so many names or attributes for this period, but it's easier for us to remember the Enlightenment period because the Enlightenment encapsulates the theme of, I guess, the entire period, which is reason and going back to rationalization and, of course, the exploration of science and philosophy. So, the Enlightenment period or the Age of Reason is in between 1660s to 1790s, roughly. And this period in the history of England is followed by the strong inclination of the Renaissance period to rationality and humanity. We said last time that the main direction or theme of the Renaissance period is that of the exploration of the humanities and the value for reason or rationality. And the Enlightenment period is not just a continuation of that foundation of the Renaissance, but a fortification, if not a strengthening of reason. Hence, it's called the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment questioned traditional authority and embraced the notion that humanity could be improved through rational change. It means that the focus on the humanity, which started in the Renaissance period, became deeper and wider in scope in terms of exploration, in terms of pursuits on science and philosophy and even literature and all the different disciplines attached to it. Okay, so there is that improvement of rational change. And during the Enlightenment period, people are convinced that changing society, addressing the ills of the sociocultural milieu of their time is basically through reason, not always by force or by revolution, but through rationalization. And these innovations in print, which started in the Renaissance period as well, became wider and more popular. That's why a lot of the ideas of scholars, of writers, even of poets and philosophers circulated wider because of print, because of newspaper and books and other printable materials. Hence, reason became the main, so to speak, the main thrust or the main theme of the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment's important 17th century precursors included the Englishman Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, the Frenchman René Descartes, which I'm sure you all are familiar with cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. That's a very popular philosophical discussion that we will not have time to talk about because we want to focus on literature, but has contributed a lot in the exploration of philosophy and, of course, the value of reason or rationality. And of course, some key natural philosophers of the scientific revolution, including Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. These are names in the philosophy of science, exploring space and substances, and of course processes when it comes to scientific developments. These are the names. But for literature, Francis Bacon is one of the most prominent names in the Enlightenment period, and he has written a lot of not just poems but even essays. Now, one of the signature contributions to scholarship is the birth of Diderot's Encyclopedia in 1751 to 1777, which brought together leading authors to produce a compilation of human knowledge. Of course, in our modern or postmodern society, right now we are familiar with Google, with Wikipedia, and all of these internet-driven sources. But back then, the compilation of knowledge or facts or lessons that are necessary in the study, in the pursuit of education back then is through encyclopedia. That's one of the I guess one of the main highlights, historical highlight or contribution of the Enlightenment period. And of course, this is the coming together of different scholars, different writers in different fields, solidifying a reference for knowledge. Hence, encyclopedia came about. And I'm sure some of your parents or grandparents still has those encyclopedias, different versions though, different brands, so to speak. But that's a very good picture of the contribution of the Enlightenment period. And another reason for the fortification of reason as the main drive to make change in society is because of the ongoing, never-ending, so to speak, problem when it comes to the separation of church and state. If you remember early on, we talked about how Chaucer, for example, pointed out some of the problems of the Roman Church during the Middle English period. And of course, there is no distinct discussion yet when it comes to the separation of church and state, but it is already a foreshadowing, I would say, of what will become of England, what will become of Europe, and what will become of the rest of the world. From the long foreshadowing of the Middle English period through Chaucer and many other writers during that time, to the Renaissance love for the humanities, the Enlightenment period began to champion the idea of the separation of church and state. Significant philosophers behind it were Jean Locke, along with French philosopher Pierre Bayle. Now, we said also in the Renaissance period that the separation of church and state has already been in the making, has already been pursued by a lot of writers, a lot of thinkers back then. But it is during the English Enlightenment period that a clear separation of church and state came about as a nomenclature, as a talk of the town, so to speak, as a knowledge, a common knowledge for people. And people became all the more critical about not just the church and the quote-unquote ills or malpractices in the church, the hypocrisy of the church, but also critical about the state. The criticism is not just addressed to the church and its effect in society, but also addressed to the state, the government, the leadership. These are people who probably wanted to create a separation from the church in terms of governance, but has also become a subject of criticism along the way because of corruption, because of let's say greed for power and many other issues attached to governance, which I would say is very much present in common societies such as the Philippines and many other countries. Now, other features or other highlights of the Enlightenment period, we have secret societies and fellowship. Let me read this. Secret societies like the Freemasons, the Bavarian Illuminati, the Rosicrucians flourished, offering European men and a few women new modes of fellowship, esoteric ritual, and mutual assistance. Now, in talking about fellowships and secret societies, I'm sure you have heard even up to date several controversies and conspiracy theories, if not videos that you have seen on YouTube or other platforms that talks about the Illuminati, talks about all of this Freemasonry, how these secret society members have different discourses on the structure of society, of culture, of government, and all of these. And secret society back then in the Enlightenment period became one of the main highlights because people are into exploration, reasoning, and thinking, and somehow secret societies became an avenue for them to converge together, to gather together, and form different hypotheses about life, about their country, about their culture, about everything. And other than secret societies, there are also common people talking about ideas in different places like coffee shops or coffee houses, newspaper and literary salons, which emerge as new venues for ideas to circulate. There are different places in the city, in the country as well, in the entire country, where people would just flock together and have quote unquote fellowship, talking about ideas, talking about reason, and of course anything about life and how rationality will be able to better life for them as a community, as a country. Now, other than these historical highlights, we also have some literary important highlights during the Enlightenment period. And of course, there are a lot, but I want to focus on few that I believe would be important for us to remember as students of English literature. And of course, one of which is Paradise Lost by John Milton. Okay, so the late 17th century writer John Milton became the foremost name in English literature after William Shakespeare of the Renaissance period. And Paradise Lost, Milton's masterpiece, is an epic poem about Satan's attempt to plan the fall of humanity set in the Garden of Eden. John Milton also penned a sequel titled Paradise Regained, in which Satan fails to corrupt Jesus. Now, if you would look at Paradise Lost, if you have time, I would really suggest that you read it for you to experience one of the highlights of the Enlightenment period in England. It's very Christian in terms of its discourse, of course, from the title itself, Paradise Lost, and some of the characters and elements there are very biblical. We have Jesus and Satan and the story of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. So these are some of the things that Milton talked about. There are so many contributors to the development of the writing style called satire, but Milton is one of them. Okay, satire has become the most celebrated writing style during the Enlightenment period because the government and the church are the most criticized institutions during that time. Many writers critically point out the ills of these institutions through satirical works. Most satires center on freedom, censorship, discrimination, public affairs, and other individual and communal restrictions. So these are some of the things that are always talked about in their satirical works during that time. Okay, criticism about the government, about the church, issues on censorship, things about discrimination, stereotypes, some of the things that are widely acceptable but is by nature wrong, such as degradation of the different roles of gender, women being subordinate, the taboos on sexuality and expression, which are things that has already been foreshadowed during the Middle English period. Remember Chaucer, and of course the Renaissance period. But again, just like what I said, what started as a criticism of religion, of the church in the Middle English and the Renaissance period became wider in the Enlightenment period. Now it also includes government, criticism to, the leaders of the land. And satire as a literary writing style became one of those popular writing styles that actually has double meaning, so to speak. Okay, it may be literal in terms of its fictional and magical features, but when you look at it as a satire, it has a lot of underlying meaning and criticism addressed to different characters that are portrayed fictionally in their writing. Satire is an artistic form, chiefly literary and dramatic, in which human or individual vices, follies, abuses, or shortcomings are held up to censure by means of ridicule, derision, burlesque, irony, parody, caricature, or other methods, sometimes with an intent to inspire social reform. These are some of the terms that are important in the discussion of a satirical work. Okay, when we say burlesque, we're talking about comic imitation of a serious literary or artistic form. Parody is an imitation as well of the style and manner of a particular writer or school of writers. Okay, parody is typically negative in intent. Caricature, on the other hand, is an exaggeration by means of often ludicrous distortion of parts or characteristics. These distortions are meant to criticize and to suggest social reforms. So satire is one of those contributions. And the rising of satire is basically because of the growing ills and malpractices both in the church and on state, the government, the leadership of the land. Hence, satire became like an escape and at the same time an assault for writers, for intellectuals to hide their propaganda and at the same time convince people that there's something wrong and push for social change. One of those is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. I'm sure you have heard of this masterpiece. It is mostly attributed to children and adolescent literature, but when you look at the entire story, it's very satirical and it criticizes a lot of the problems of England in the time of the Enlightenment period. Jonathan Swift is an Irish-English author and one of the most famous satirists in literary history. He wrote many works of satirical prose on a wide variety of socio-political issues, including their own English-Irish conflict. Jonathan Swift's masterpiece is this novel, Gulliver's Travels, a criticism about ethics, politics, and society, satirically written in a series of magic and fantasy adventures. Now, the inclusion of magic and fantasy are not something new in English literature. Of course, you know, from the early Old English period where paganism is still very much felt in their literary heritage, such as Beowulf, there are already inclusion of magic and fantasy. But those fantastic themes in their literary pieces are all influenced by paganism and the transition to the early Christian or the pre-Christian tradition. But satire has a different kind of magic and fantasy discourse. It means that the element of magic and fantasy is a form of propaganda to hide something and to address something in the society. So it's not just because of religious undertone, but it's more of a socio-political use. Magic and fantasy is used for socio-political advances. So another feature of the literary heritage during the Enlightenment period is its additional scientific and skeptic flavor in their literature or their writing style. The Enlightenment was, at its center, a celebration of ideas about what the human mind was capable of and what could be achieved through deliberate action and scientific methodology. Many of the new enlightened ideas, even in literature, were critical and political in nature, and intellectuals began to consider the possibility that freedom and democracy were the fundamental rights of all people, not gifts bestowed upon them by beneficent monarchs or popes. Hence, many literary works centered on providing a different angle to religiosity and supremacy of the monarchy. If you would notice, a lot of the writings during the time of the Enlightenment period included scientific ideas, not just the typical emotion and romance, but the inclusion of science in the literary piece, the direction of philosophy and science embedded in certain pieces of literature, even in satirical works, have already been felt in a lot of the writings back in the Enlightenment period. Okay, you would see that even in poetry, even in different essays, and of course the early beginnings of prose writing and certain fiction. These are the literary heritages, the literary features of the Enlightenment period. Next time, we will take a look at sample works, sample pieces of poetry during the Enlightenment period, such as William Blake's The Tiger and the Lamb, and we will compare and contrast these two and see how the Enlightenment period shaped and informed the different writing styles and themes, if not the tone and the discourse attached to these two pieces of poetry. Okay, so I hope you learned something today in our Enlightenment period discussion. Next meeting, we will talk about these sample works and continue the discussion on the Enlightenment period. Thank you for listening.